5 Lakewood Drive in Cranberry Estates is about 8 miles from 73 Shadeland Drive. Just to give you an idea of the distance in Greenfield, Indiana, between the Snedegar home, where Lora Morris went missing, and the home of the Lindner family. On the morning of September 17, 1981, 9 days after Tony Lambert was last seen in New Orleans, the plant foreman at Indiana Aircraft Hardware Company in Indianapolis made his usual 6 a.m. wake-up call to Jeni Lindner, the president of the company. The phone rang for about 3 minutes until finally, 8-year-old Valerie answered. "Al, come over quick. Something's wrong with Daddy," she told him. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the residence at just after 6:15. Jeni Lindner had been badly beaten, and his throat had been cut while he lay in bed. Law enforcement has never associated Jeni Lindner's murder to that of Steve Snedegar or the death of his daughter. But I think it's important to dig a little bit deeper into that, given the time frame. Also, there are issues around the sale and or transport of drugs in both stories, which we'll get into in a bit. And then there's John Munden's relationship with the Lindner family, which is also important to explore. He would later go on to marry Nieves Lindner, Jeni's Cuban-born wife. Some of Nieves' family members landed in the States from Cuba, having joined the wave of outcasts who fled to the U.S. as part of what was known as the Freedom Flotilla, hundreds of thousands of refugees packed like sardines in makeshift boats, escaping Castro's revolution and seeking safe harbor in a country whose most familiar symbol made such a promise. A famous sonnet was written by Emma Lazarus for a fundraiser auction to raise money for the pedestal that the Statue of Liberty sits upon, and in that sonnet was the promise, which most of us only know by one line. Not like that brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame. "Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Nieves and Jeni had brought several of her relatives from Cuba in the year leading up to his murder, some of whom had stayed in the Lindner home at certain points. Let's step back in time for a minute, though, and talk about their early life together. In the 1960s, Jeni worked as a salesman dealing in parts used in the airline industry. Nieves worked at a grocery store in Indianapolis. The two met at a bar and they hit it off. They were both married at the time, though, so they divorced and married each other in January of 1965. In the late 70s, Jeni started his own company, Indiana Aircraft Hardware Company, and essentially became competition to the company that he used to work for. Within the aircraft business, government contracts are a large source of income, and he would end up incorporating his company with Nieves as a 51% stockholder in order to benefit from the minority owner, qualifying it as a minority business. Jeni Lindner was a businessman, and he knew a lot of people. They had annual hog roasts at their house with 200-plus people, and they hosted neighborhood parties, which always garnered a large crowd. Hosting other influential businessmen from the area was not uncommon in the Lindner home. But there are indications that all was not well within the home, including divorce filings as far back as 1976. An in-depth article in the Indianapolis Star, dated July 3, 1988, quoted one co-worker saying, "Nieves said she owned 51% of the business and suggested that he better toe the line. They got to fighting and I got out." "They would fight like cats and dogs," another former friend and business acquaintance said. Hancock County Sheriff Nick Gulling told reporters that John Munden, quote, entered their lives during one of the suicide attempts when he was sent to the home to talk Gene Lindner out of killing himself. Sheriff Gulling said that the two later became good friends, with Lindner later agreeing to help and finance Munden if he chose to run for sheriff. This same article tells another story about how in the early 1980s, Nieves persuaded Gene to hire 14 Cubans, but he ended up firing them because he said that they wouldn't work. According to his former lawyer, James A. Buck, Nieves threatened to blow the whistle on Gene if he didn't hire them back. Buck said that the threat was that she would tell authorities that her controlling interest in the minority ownership was in name only. The article goes on to describe Gene Lindner being scared that the Cubans might retaliate against him. Gene Lindner moved out of the Cranberry Estates home and filed for divorce on August 5, 1981. The petition reads as follows. Due to the marital strife, said businessmen can no longer function in an orderly fashion if Nieves Lindner is allowed to come about said place of business. Judge Richard Milan issued a restraining order barring Nieves from their business. The next day, she filed for divorce and asked the court to bar Lindner from their home, which it did. 2 days before Lora Morris went missing, Gene Lindner's complaint was served to Nieves Lindner by none other than Hancock County Sheriff's Deputy John Munden. In the 2 weeks to follow, the Lindners came to an agreement regarding their home. Nieves would stay there, and Gene would continue the business with Nieves handling the clerical aspect. They agreed to consult each other before making any business decisions and basically stay out of each other's way. Gene agreed to pay the mortgage on the home, and they would both be paid $20,000 a year by the business. The agreement said, quote, each party shall be restrained from bothering, molesting, threatening, or in any way interfering with the other, and each party shall be restrained from selling, transferring, or in any way disposing of any property owned by the parties. Well, that certainly makes it sound like their days at the office are going to be a goddamn delight, doesn't it? It would only be a couple weeks after this agreement was signed that Nieves would ask Gene to come back and stay at the Cranberry Estates home with their children, while she went to Cuba for a visit. He moved back in on September 12th. 5 days later, 47-year-old Gene Lindner would be murdered in their bed. If I were to guess, it's the timing of all that would be wildly suspicious to police. When I spoke with sources close to the family, they wanted to address the issue of Nieves being out of town when the homicide occurred, since that seemed to be something that was focused on in the media. I was told this. When you defect from a communist country, you don't just go back for a visit. You go on a waiting list, and Nieves was on that list since 1962. When her number came up, she had to go. She hadn't seen her parents and other family for years. Nieves didn't even learn that both of her parents had passed away until she arrived in Cuba on that visit. John Munden was one of the deputies initially assigned to the Lindner homicide case, and according to the same article, he interviewed many of Gene's friends and acquaintances, many of which immediately pointed to Nieves and said, yeah, you ought to check her out on this. According to Hancock County Sheriff Nick Gulling, a couple days after Nieves got back from Cuba, she paid off-duty deputies to guard her home. No word on whether John Munden was one of these deputies, and I don't think he was because he was a bit busy with the Lora Morris homicide case, but can we just stop here for a minute and ponder how this is now the second time during this podcast that I have told you about how people close to a murder investigation are handing cash over to Hancock County Sheriff's Department, and it's apparently being accepted with the gusto that I generally reserve for shoving a glazed donut into my big old sasshole. How is this not raising any red flags at all with local journalists or activists or, frankly, anyone? I kind of feel like I'm in the middle of a Fellini movie. Weird shit is happening all around me, but nobody's reacting to any of it.
John had been up to their home, or the department had. Let me put it that way. The department has, and I'm assuming maybe him on more than one occasion, because of domestic situations or this or that or the other. My understanding was never on a social basis, but always on a like a domestic situation, but they were not total strangers to the sheriff's department.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Jean died, John was the initial investigator on the case, as I recall. No, he was not. Malcolm Grass, the sheriff, was, I think, the lead investigator on the case and responded up there to that. And at some point, the department involved John in that investigation. Somewhere during the next ensuing, I don't know exactly, probably a couple of years, he and of course they eventually did solve that crime.
Tell me what it was, because said they didn't. Who did they attribute it to?
Oh, no. Two of Nieves' brothers.
Well, I knew there was drug arrest.
I think they both went to jail for it.
Not for this homicide. They went to jail for well, one of her brothers died in jail for the drug trafficking.
Maybe so, but I know that there was. Let's put it this way: it was considered solved.
So they thought that, definitely the brother was involved with Nieves in the drug trafficking. Both of them went to jail for that. So they did believe that they were also responsible for Jean's death.
They never were able to connect it to Nieves, but certainly to her brother. And they're convinced that because I'm trying to remember the details. There was something about, his throat was cut and this or that, but there were a couple of things that seemed, as I recall, that the cops indicated were sort of typical methods of operation in the drug world.
Yeah, the newspaper articles did say blunt force trauma and then the throat cut. So yeah. I did remember seeing both.
The two kids were home at the time.
Yeah, awful, just awful.
And I don't think there was any, as I recall, there was no sign of forced entry.
No.
Now, maybe I'm wrong about that.
Right, you're right. Yeah.
So, I don't think it was considered closed. They just felt like, her brother or brothers were involved in that.
All
and
right.
were never able really to pin it on that Nieves necessarily had anything to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Even though she was involved with her brother in the drug deal and the drug trade a bit.
Did they believe that there was drug trade going on before Jean Lindner died?
Yeah, well, I don't think they know. I don't think they knew whether there was or not.
Sheriff Malcolm Grass said, quote, "Munden and other deputies are still working on the case, running down leads, and eliminating suspects." So it appears that at least 3 weeks in, Munden was now working on 2 homicide cases. That earlier Indianapolis Star article that I quoted from July 3rd, 1988, it also included this quote by former Hancock County prosecutor Larry Gossett. "There was never enough evidence to charge anybody in the case. There was not even anything to go fishing with." It's what would come later, in 1988, that would eventually cause John Munden to step down from his position with the Hancock County Sheriff's Department. An Indianapolis Star article dated June 23, 88, written by R. Joseph Gellarden and George McLaren, said this: "The estranged wife of Hancock County's Chief Deputy Sheriff and her brother were held without bond Wednesday after police confiscated $62,500 and more than a pound of cocaine in a raid on her exclusive suburban Greenfield home. Nieves Lindner Munden, 49, wife of Chief Deputy John Munden, and her brother, Armando Martinez of Miami, were arrested on federal charges of conspiracy and intent to distribute cocaine and carrying a firearm while trafficking in drugs. The raid Tuesday night resulted in the largest cocaine seizure in Hancock County history, and it occurred at the site of one of the county's most notorious unsolved homicides, according to Hancock County Sheriff Nick Gulling. Mrs. Munden's previous husband, Gene Lindner, died in August of 1981 after his throat was cut 3 times as he slept in the home. Munden, 41, investigated the slaying and later married Mrs. Munden and lived in the house. U.S. Attorney Deborah J. Daniels declined to comment when asked if the cocaine investigation involved John Munden. But Munden was defended by his boss.
Captain Munden is a good policeman, and I find it difficult to believe he had any knowledge of that activity.
Gulling said he did not know the combined federal and state anti-drug task force was conducting an investigation in Hancock County until raiders called him just before the raid started. The searchers included representatives of the federal DEA, the Metropolitan Task Force, Indiana State Police, the Henry County Area Drug Task Force, and the Indiana Department of Conservation. Munden was called to the scene of the raid Tuesday evening by his estranged wife's children. The chief deputy denied knowing of any illegal activities in the house. Munden, a sheriff's deputy since 1977, was not charged in connection with the case and is not under departmental investigation, Gulling said. The arrests were triggered by a 6-month state and federal drug probe that began when informants say they purchased cocaine from a Cuban female, quote, who had some kind of relationship with a law enforcement officer. Records say police used unidentified undercover informants to make several drug purchases from the Munden home in the past 5 months, which the suspect reportedly kept track of on a home computer. Gulling said Munden had not been living in the home for several months because his wife filed for divorce March 9th. The marriage, which lasted less than 2 years, was the second for the couple. Despite the divorce filing, Munden was a silent spectator during the federal court hearing, watching from the spectator section as deputy U.S. Marshals handcuffed his wife and brother-in-law and led them from the courtroom. Since the death of her first husband, she has operated Indiana Aircraft, a supplier of aircraft equipment, out of her home. Neighbors said they had not suspected illegal activity at the house, the only home at the end of a cul-de-sac on a secluded tree-lined lot. One neighbor said Mrs. Munden was a friendly, outgoing woman who had won a countywide competition last winter for Best Decorated Christmas Home. Another neighbor said he didn't suspect John Munden as being involved in illegal drug activities.
I'd be totally shocked. He's one of the good guys, a Captain America type.
Nieves, her brother Armando, and a 21-year-old named Kevin Beasley were indicted on multiple charges related to a drug operation being run from that Cranberry Estates home, including using a firearm in these dealings that had been modified into a fully automatic machine gun-type weapon. Larry Furness, the Indiana State Police Superintendent, said John Munden passed an FBI polygraph about whether he took part in the drug dealing, but it was inconclusive regarding questions around whether he was aware of the drug activity before and after he separated from his wife. Neither John nor Nieves were implicated in the murder of Gene Lindner, her former husband. All of this polygraph information only came out after a 12-week investigation into alleged improprieties around John Munden and the Hancock County Sheriff's Department's involvement in multiple cases, including Gene Lindner, Lora Morris, and the murder-suicide of 2 Marion County Sheriff's deputies, a case that John Munden also took part in investigating. In that same July 1988 in-depth Indianapolis Star article, it went on to say that during a federal magistrate's bond hearing for Nieves that same year, quote, Munden said Indiana Aircraft's business shrank under her leadership. He said the business moved out of a warehouse to a location on US 40 west of Greenfield and then to the Cranberry Estates home. Munden testified the inventory was kept in the garage and the business had shrunk to about a fourth of its former size. At that bond hearing, Munden said that by the summer of 1983, he and Nieves were in love and living together. In June of 1983, Munden filed for divorce from his wife of 19 years. Nieves and John lived together for about a year, and then they married. But only a month into marital bliss, Nieves filed for divorce, asking for a court order to keep John Munden from the Lindner home. Somewhere in there, the passion must have rekindled because on May 23, 1986, they got married again. But they hit another speed bump 8 months later when another divorce was imminent. Munden was in, Munden was out. but he ended up staying until late January of 1988. From the stand, John Munden pledged his love for Nieves and said that he didn't want a divorce. He hoped to get back together with her when she was released from prison. As Nieves was handcuffed and led away by deputy U.S. Marshals, John Munden looked at his estranged wife, or ex-wife? Hell, I'm not even sure where they were at this point, but Munden whispered to her across the courtroom, "I love you." Now let's go over the bullet points. Make sure we are all on the same page. Jean Lindner was killed. Sometime thereafter, John Munden married Jean's widow, Nieves. Sometime after that, Nieves is arrested on drug charges. And sometime after that, there was an investigation into all of that and more. In the summer of 1988, the Marion County prosecutor asked the feds to step in and look at 3 unsolved homicides. All the cases were originally assigned to John Munden, although some would later be reassigned. A letter was sent from the Marion County prosecutor to U.S. Attorney General Deborah Daniels, which alleged that the investigation, led by the Metro Drug Task Force, had uncovered new information related to the Lindner murder and the murder-suicide of 2 former Marion County deputy sheriffs in Hancock County. There was clearly a conflict of interest in having Hancock County investigate their own investigations, but the feds were not inclined to step in, so the Indiana State Police were given the unfortunate task of unspooling the whole mess, to see if there was any there. This new information that the Marion County prosecutor cited was never actually revealed, but it was his office that supervised the task force that developed the case against Nieves Munden. Multiple sources in Hancock and Marion counties, who declined to be identified for the Indianapolis Star article, raised questions about Munden since his wife's arrest. One of the things that they pointed to was John Munden's alleged pledge to destroy a videotape that was taken into custody during the investigation into the deaths of the murder-suicide victim cops. This tape had been found during a search of that crime scene, and it allegedly showed people engaged in sex acts, specifically at least one Hancock County deputy. Some sources alleged that John Munden wanted to destroy the tape to protect the Hancock County Sheriff's Department. So, yeah, John Munden's bacon was firmly planted in the skillet, and grease was a-poppin' all around him. I think it's fair to say that by July 4th of 1988, the mood wasn't all hot dogs and wedges of juicy watermelon at Hancock County Sheriff's Department. Indianapolis Star headlines on July 3rd read as follows: Inquiry reveals Hancock County Sheriff's Department secret sex tapes, sex videos at center of storm involving homicide and credibility. The first paragraph reads as follows: The arrest of Nieves Lindner Munden on drug charges inadvertently prompted disclosure of one of the most closely held secrets in the Hancock County Sheriff's Department. 2 of its deputies appear in sexually explicit homemade videotapes, now simply called The Tapes. And The Tapes was in all caps. There is not a cop in the universe that wants their name associated with a headline like that, and I can only imagine that John Munden was slapping on a bit more deodorant and a broader smile every morning as he headed out the door dodging eager journalists in an effort to stave off the questions and unseemly body odors associated with being in the hottest of hot seats. This one had drugs, sex, and murder, a holy trinity. Probably had newsrooms collectively drooling in anticipation. Hell, you could cover that one 6 ways from Sunday. Put a reporter on every angle. Rumors flew regarding who was and was not captured in the video, and how it was all related to the drug takedown of Nieves Munden, as well as the murder-suicide of Marion County Sheriff's deputies Phil Moore and Thomas Winkle. When reporters started asking specifically for names of individuals depicted in the video, Hancock County Sheriff Nick Gulling said, quote, "They know who they are. This not only affects them, but all members of the department." He said all deputies were catching heat due to the rumors, which he qualified as, quote, "a problem with 2 or 3 people which is affecting everyone." Citing concerns for their families, law enforcement declined to identify the deputies, but Gulling told reporters that the pair were known within the department because they stood and identified themselves during a departmental meeting. Oh, to have been a fly on the wall for that one. For perspective, by the way, his department included 21 full-time employees, 7 jail and communications deputies, and 30 reserve deputies, so that's really only about 5% of their staff sexing it up on tape. Gulling made sure to tell reporters that he was still waiting on this alleged new evidence that had started this whole fiasco in the first place. When asked for comment, C. Thomas Cohn, a Greenfield attorney representing the sheriff's department in civil cases, said, "I've seen them. What's on those tapes is being exaggerated out of proportion. I can't believe it." To be fair, Attorney Cohn, that's what happens when you don't let the bright light of the sun determine these things. Withholding information that the public has a right to know, when you're talking about law enforcement officers, you run the risk of things being taken out of proportion. If it wasn't a big deal, they probably should have released the contents of the tape and taken their chances. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that they should have racked that puppy up on the 5:30 local news, but a brief description of what it included was probably in order. And yes, I absolutely do believe cops have a right to privacy. But in this case, at least one deputy was on duty when the videotaping occurred. The incidents depicted on the tape were said to have occurred years earlier, in 1979 or 1980, and a specific date couldn't be determined, but a deputy's police radio could be heard bleeding out in the background, providing at least some clue about the time frame involved. This whole situation got so out of control there were 2 separate court actions in 2 separate counties related to the destruction of the tapes that dare not speak its name. One of Deputy Moore's heirs wanted those tapes, but they were ordered by a judge to be held as possible evidence, safe from tampering or destruction, until the investigations were completed, at which time the family's attorney expected to ask the judge to order the tapes and photos, oh yes, there were photos, to be destroyed. By October of that year, the 12-week probe came to a slow, grinding halt, and the findings were rather disappointing. If you're the kind of person who prefers that massive crash of wave after a steadily built crescendo. The 3-month investigation revealed no criminal wrongdoing or inappropriate handling by members of the Hancock County Sheriff's Department or the Hancock County Prosecutor's Office. Indiana State Police issued their final report, and included in its findings, they did mention that one sheriff's deputy could still face departmental action and qualified this as, quote, matters that may be considered as internal conduct problems that would be turned over to the appropriate local authorities. The report said that the Lindner and Morris cases would be assigned an Indiana State Police investigator who would continue to work on those cases. The Moore-Winkle murder-suicide was confirmed to be a murder-suicide, but the side issue of the videotape was characterized as having been made in the early 1980s, and it depicted deputies Moore and Winkle plus 3 women and at least 2 Hancock County Sheriff's Department officers in embarrassing situations. One deputy in particular was described as being involved in explicit activities in the video. The tapes themselves were collected at the Moore-Winkle crime scene, and it was determined that they had 0 evidentiary value in the investigation of their deaths. At this time, Hancock County Sheriff Nick Gulling wanted to make it perfectly clear that John Munden was not one of the officers depicted in the videotape. Regarding those polygraphs that John Munden took that came out inconclusive, determining whether he was aware of his wife's drug-related activities would be purely speculative, Sheriff Gulling said.
There may have been some clues that maybe he should have picked up on and he didn't, but it is conclusive that he had no direct knowledge or involvement in the drug operation.
As far as any drug connections or mishandling of investigations, I think everybody was cleared
Right. Yes.
Of that. There were, I knew a couple of, I didn't know it at the time, but I mean, subsequently it turned out that I knew a couple of the deputies who were involved in the sex tape thing. And one of them got in pretty good trouble because it was determined that he was on duty and in uniform.
Right.
When when some of these things were transpiring, and I can't remember whether they fired him or just suspended him or what. But I knew one of those guys, not the murdered guys, but the guys that subsequently from the investigation.
But did you ever learn? So I'm curious to know what started all this new information apparently that came from the multi-agency task force investigating the drug trafficking stuff in Hancock County. Did you ever learn what this new information was that made them want to open it in the first place?
It doesn't ring a bell that I ever did.
Yeah.
I mean, could I say 100% that I didn't know at the time? No. But sitting here now, I don't recall anything that brought that. I know there was quite a big stink when these two Marion County guys who lived in Hancock County were found dead.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was probably well, as you might imagine, anytime two police officers are found dead in their house, you know, there's going to be. I mean, investigators are going to come out of the woodwork to try and solve that.
Yeah.
I can't remember whether the sex tape that we were talking about included any drug usage. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it didn't say that in the thing, and that's why I couldn't put it together. It seems like they found the tape by accident when they were right, and so, but it came part of this whole investigation because obviously, oh my God, we got two cops that are dead. We've got some cops that are having sex on tape or God knows what. Then we've got three unsolved crimes, and are they related or are they not? Because the investigator in all three of them, at least some point, John was in all the investigations at some point, his wife was arrested. That's what spurred this. She got arrested and then all this happened.
Yeah.
Right.
No, and I'm sure that's probably, how it came about, and they probably just decided, listen, to be prudent, we're going to check all this shit out.
Yeah.
We don't want anybody to be able to say that we've looked the other way if something wrong's going on.
Yeah.
So we're gonna dig into it and double check. Now, it's not a big shock. I think probably fairly important to note. It's not a big shock that John was at some point involved in all those investigations. The sheriff's department only had two detectives.
Right.
And by that time, one of them was not really as much a detective as he was a crime scene tech. So really, John was their primary detective, and we didn't have a lot of cases, a lot of murder cases. Although we did go through a spate there for a while where we had several, but most all were unrelated to one another, except for the Lora Morris deaths.
Right.
In a county where at the time, one homicide a year was a shocker.
Mm-hmm.
We probably went through a period where there were 4 or 5 in the space of a couple of years, and that was really unusual. So I'm sure it probably drew a lot of attention, but it's no surprise that John would have at some point been involved in all those because, hell, he was the only detective they had for the most part.
And like you said, as this all played out and what happened with Nieves and the whole drug thing, it makes sense that all of this was investigated, especially, just to make sure that, well, we got 3 unsolved cases, we got this, we got all this stuff going on. I understand all of that. My only question out of all of this was, what is this new information that a drug task force comes up with that now it is, then they're opening up an investigation? But even in your reporting, it seems to me that you were basically saying, but nobody's telling us what this new information is. We've never seen it. We don't know it. Did it even exist? Is this a political maneuver? I thought political maneuver, and I heard it. I thought...
Well, and it very well could be. I mean, it very well could be. Now, I will tell you that there were... Which kind of, I guess, now that I think about it, I hadn't really thought about it before, but there were several people, even on the department, on the sheriff's department there, who simply refused to believe that John didn't know what was going on with Nieves. Even though he was living there, they were separated, knowing John. Nobody that knew John would ever have believed that he would have known or been involved. But there were some guys probably guys for various political reasons, or just I don't like the SOB or whatever, just refuse to believe. I mean, I heard more than once, the arguments of, well, he sure as hell must not be much of a detective. He couldn't even find the drugs in his own house, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But of course, he,
I mean, you have to admit it. If you don't know John Munden, it looks bad on paper.
Yeah,
I mean,
I mean, it kind of does. I agree, but like I say, I've known him from 1981, I guess, until he passed away last year or earlier this year, whenever it was, and there were just folks that just simply wouldn't let go of that.
Right. Now we come to a point in this part of the story that's murky, in my opinion, and I debated about how to deliver the information to be fair to all parties involved. But it boils down to this. I reached out to the Lindner family, who were initially hesitant to even discuss the case with me. They did not want to participate in the podcast. But they did answer questions for me by email, and I am grateful to them for that. I can only report what I would consider both sides of this issue as having been told to me, and let you, the listener, consider both. What I mean when I say both sides is that I have spoken with sources who I feel are very supportive of John Munden, and through their interviews, they have seemed to me perhaps a bit defensive on his behalf. The other side in this case would be the Lindner family, who said something jarringly different about the relationships that Jean Lindner had with both John Munden and Steve Snedegar. The very first thing a source close to the Lindner family said to me in our initial conversation was this, quote, "I guess probably your first question is whether Jean Lindner knew Steve Snedegar. The answer to that is yes. I can't tell you 100% for sure when they first met, but I can tell you that John Munden brought him, meaning Steve, to the Cranberry Estates house a few times. John and Jean obviously did know each other before he was murdered." Okay, so that jumped right the hell off the page at me because I had been under the impression, or rather the assumption, that Hancock County Sheriff's Deputy John Munden had never met Steve Snedegar, or any of the Snedegars, prior to rolling up on that house on Shadeland Drive the day Trudy Snedegar reported her daughter missing. But that's not the story that Lindner family sources are telling me. I was told that not only did Steve Snedegar know Jean Lindner, and had been to the Cranberry Estates home, but he had been brought there by John Munden. Now first off, let's be clear, that did happen. We know it happened after Jean Lindner died. John Munden marries Nieves Munden, and there were apparently times, which nobody disputes, where he brought Steve Snedegar to his house. Now, I can't fathom, personally, why a sheriff's deputy would be bringing the subject of an investigation to his home. By a month and a half at the latest, after Lora Morris went missing, John Munden was well aware that Tony McCullah had disappeared, and that Steve Snedegar asked John Munden, rather coyly, just afterward, what would happen to a body if it was tossed out of an airplane over the Gulf of Mexico. So let us all be very clear. John Munden probably should not have been bringing Steve Snedegar to his house for any reason whatsoever at any time. But right now we're talking specifically about the difference between bad judgment and a flat-out lie. Because John Munden told the Indiana State Police investigators during his debrief on the Lora Morris case that he had never met the Snedegars before Lora Morris went missing. Never heard of them, he said. So now, let's get back to dissecting whether John Munden brought Steve Snedegar to the Cranberry Estates home before Jean Lindner died. Dave Scott believes the Lindner family has this timeline wrong. He believes that Steve Snedegar and John Munden had been there together only after Lindner was murdered.
To the best of my personal knowledge and anybody I ever talked to, John did not know Steve Snedegar before Laura's disappearance.
It seems like that would come. And the thing that Danny pointed out, which I think is fair, is so he would have to show up to this crime scene. Well, not crime scene at that point, but he's been called to the Gertrude's house. He'd have to be a pretty good actor to act like he's never met any of these people while he's standing there interviewing them, right? So I get your point. I can only say what they're saying. And maybe, remember, they were younger, so they're looking back on it for many years,
And if you, and I have no reason to doubt you, if you say Lindner knew Steve, that's very possible. I have no information one way or the other on that. Now, is there a possibility? I mean, I've been to people's houses for parties and stuff where there are all kinds of people, and I've met them, but that doesn't mean 2 months later I remembered who they were.
Exactly.
I mean, could something like that have occurred? Yeah.
Right.
But to say that John was taking Steve up there, I just don't buy that for a second.
Okay, and that's why I wanted to talk to you, because that was one thing that I didn't. Steve said he didn't. Yeah. I mean, John said he didn't. So, I wanted to kind of get and she did, by the way, because she did, they have parties there. They had pig roast. They had things going on,
Yeah.
So that would explain that. My question was, because we've got a drug situation in that household, and there's gossip about, and some, like you said, some stuff that we see in Snedegar's life that looks like he might have been dealing with drugs. So did these two lanes, merge at one point, or is that just a coincidence?
I can't answer that for you.
Yeah.
If it did, it never came to light, as far as I know.
Right. That's what I'm hearing. Right. Nothing.
But it wouldn't really surprise me that you could have, for example, Lindner and Snedegar both being businessmen in a small community like Greenfield, that they would not necessarily have known each other. That doesn't surprise me that they knew each other.
Yep.
But making a connection to Steve, other than through a common friend, maybe at a party or something like that, I have no reason whatsoever to believe that they knew each other prior.
Danny Chalice, Lora's brother-in-law, also spent a good deal of time working with John Munden, giving him information on the family, and he, too, did not believe Steve Snedegar had known John before Lora Morris was killed.
I do know that John knew Gene Lindner before Gene Lindner got killed. It's the Steve part and the three of them knowing each other. That's the problem I got. Because look, I'm going to be honest, when Lindner got killed, my very first thought was that was Steve Snedegar, because it is correct that was right after Lambert disappeared and the police were questioning him about Lambert. So, and I always thought, my first thought was, well, Steve Snedegar killed that man just so it filled their plate up and they wouldn't be able to do anything proper. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. That's pure speculation. Because listen, before Lora disappeared, John Munden was never a name that was mentioned. He was never around. John Munden knew nothing about the Snedegars. This is the way it seemed to me. And I don't have any reason in my mind to doubt that. And that's what my gut feeling is. And I hope my gut feeling pans out, because if it don't, then I'm going to say it for a third time now, that creates, in my mind, a real serious problem.
Yeah.
Man, I'd hate to see it really run that deep. How do you pull that off? How do you fake going to that house and acting like you never met anybody there and going to investigate their daughter's disappearance?
I totally get what you're saying now, but that's not necessarily the case. Steve could have known him and not Trudy. They could have met casually, at one of these Lindner events and not really had any contact. The reason why I had to be very specific about Munden knowing Snedegar beforehand is because of that pile of cash that he brought and put on his desk like 2 days after Lora's murder. That looks much more nefarious if they know each other, right? That's more of a bribe.
It was after her murder. It was at least after her disappearance.
Right. But you see how the impropriety would be much different if they knew each other and he was handing him that money. You know what I mean?
I get that 100%.
Right. And that's why I needed to check it, because...
Right. And I really still feel truly in my heart the cash that he took in and put on Munden's desk, I believe it was $10,000. That was for surveillance, for everybody that John thought might, put on extra deputies is what that was for.
I'm interested to see when we get the documents from Hancock County, if that's mentioned in the report, if there was any accounting done with it.
There would have certainly had to have been accounting for it.
Yeah, I would hope. But it doesn't look good. You know what I mean? You're someone that ends up being a target of the investigation handed you a pile of money. That doesn't look good. Through other people, Nieves Lindner herself said this. She confirmed multiple times that Steve was at the Lindner home prior to Jean having been killed, and John Munden had brought him there prior to Jean being killed. She said it was at a time when Dave Scott was not yet friendly with the family, so he wouldn't have known about that time period. Dave Scott would, however, later become a good friend of the Lindner family, and they have no doubt that his defense of John Munden on this point was due to him believing that John had never brought Steve there, but not knowing it to be a fact. The Lindner sources said John Munden had aspirations of running for sheriff, and that's corroborated in the news articles of the time, even according to his boss, Nick Gulling. His socializing with local businessmen would have likely been an effort toward that end, to garner future support. To be fair, I want to say that I am working with the memories of an 80-something woman who, let's be clear, went to federal prison for her part in selling drugs out of her home, and she could certainly have motives of her own for wanting to associate Steve Snedegar, someone who also may have had some drug associations, with being at her home and perhaps even related to her husband's death. Her ex-husband's case was never solved. There has never been an arrest. And according to newspaper reports, family and associates of Jean's pointed directly at her at the time. One story I heard did make me wonder, though. Prior to Jean's death, Steve Snedegar was at the Cranberry Estates home and he made this comment. "If you aren't happy here, you'd never be happy anywhere." Those who heard the comment weren't sure how to take it. Was Steve just commenting on the beautiful home and the setting? Was he commenting on Nieves herself? Or could he have known about the prior suicide call and domestic issues? And if that's the case, how would he have found that out? It's certainly something that he could have learned from John Munden. My sources within the Lindner family were not sure how much Gene Lindner knew about Steve Snedegar's business, but I was told that Gene was the type who would make it his business to find out what he needed to know. So, quote, "I'm sure he knew quite a bit about Steve." "I think we've all heard the rumors that Steve was running drugs because he had an airplane," another source said. I hope I've laid out that point fairly for both sides, and I will leave it to you guys to decide what you think. I didn't feel comfortable leaving it out of my reporting, but I also recognize that it's important to note when I have no proof to support something I have been told by a source. In this case, I had separate sources that were saying vastly different things, and what I believed to be enough muddy water in my own thinking that I felt I should include it. I am still undecided on whether John Munden brought Steve Snedegar to the Lindner home on occasions before Gene Lindner was killed, or whether the case was related and what the relationship between those men was. I do believe that there are questions that deserve honest investigation. Regardless of all of that, the summer of 1988 was a bad summer for John Munden. Lots of legal stuff going on, in addition to a wife now headed off to prison. I learned that he became the legal guardian of Nieves' 2 children, and continued to live at the Cranberry Estates home with them, which I think says something about the man, given that they had been estranged and in the process of their second divorce at the time. Nieves Munden was sentenced to 5 years, but ended up doing around 3 years in prison. So either the feds didn't think she was the mastermind behind the drug trafficking, or they didn't have enough evidence to pin it on her. Her brother, however, died in prison. He ended up getting the lion's share of the time. It sounds to me like John Munden was in love with Nieves. He kept her kids safe while she was in prison. The two were together total about 18 years on and off, and they were described to me as complete opposites who could not live together but even after the divorce remained friends and worked together. As for his job with the Hancock County Sheriff's Department, John Munden had resigned as chief deputy during that summer of swirling controversy. But on February 14th, 1989, he officially resigned altogether after his wife's conviction. He said the unfounded allegations made it impossible for him to do his job. It's ironic that Munden would leave the job that he loved on Valentine's Day because of his relationship with the woman he loved. A source close to the Lindner family told me this: that's all John ever wanted to be, was a police officer.
If there was any mistake, in my view, if there was any mistake made in this investigation, it was initially assuming that the family was telling you the truth and that they were victims of this abduction. Because by the time they started to piece together that none of the shit they were telling them was true, quite a bit of time had gone past, and a lot of things were, it's like, oh, well, shit, I sure wish I could go back now and ask these questions about things I know now. I wish I could have asked them that day.
That actually goes to Munden as far as suggesting that he didn't know Steve beforehand, because if he knew him, he would if he knew him, anything about him at all, he wouldn't be trusting him at all. He wouldn't have.
I don't know anybody that, as I've talked to other folks, as the investigation went on, and I went with John a number of times to talk to different people, and I don't know anybody that said they knew him that didn't think he was at least a very odd duck.
Oh, yeah.
If not shady, or I don't know, I don't trust that guy, or he's really screwed. I don't know anybody that said, oh yeah, Steve, what a great guy.
Trudy either. Neither one of them. Except for, aside from their grandkids, who both love Trudy very much, or all love Trudy. Nobody says anything good about any of them in the whole family, really. None of them. Yeah. Almost. Yeah.
They were just about as dysfunctional, I think, as you could get. From almost any perspective you want to look at it. I mean, the way they treated Lora was pretty well documented from eyewitnesses, which was just tragic. And no wonder she didn't want to go down there with them.
And then, two of the sad things that hit me here is that Lora, she had two bad choices. She could go back with Bryce, and that relationship wasn't going anywhere. She could stay with her parents. She didn't even have a job because they had left her. She kind of was in a bad spot at that moment in her life,
Sure.
The other tragedy in this, to me, has to do with John Munden, and that is that I think he probably loved Nieves, yet the one thing he really loved to do was be a cop, and he lost that because of her. That's basically what happened. So there's
that is what happened.
Yeah.
And even though, they eventually, got back on speaking terms and, and worked some together in some other capacities and things. It just, he knew that, let's get this way. I never heard him say or infer that Nieves didn't do what she was accused of. I never heard him say, well, she didn't do that, or she was wrongly convicted or wrongly accused. I never heard him say that one time. But despite that, he remained throughout the whole thing relatively supportive. Yeah, I mean, he would take there was a train that used to run over to the prison in West Virginia where she was incarcerated, and he'd make that trip several times a year.
Yeah, Danny said he drove with him sometimes too to go visit her.
Just to go down and say hi, and I mean he was fairly loyal, and John was a loyal type guy.
Well, he took care of her kids after she went to prison. I mean, that says a lot to me about who he was. Not
to the point of being willing to break the law, but to the point of as the church saying goes, you can hate the sin and love the sinner. John was loyal to her, and I think that probably too created a lot of hard feelings among the guys on the department. He never said she didn't do it. Never said she didn't deserve to go to prison. Never said she wasn't guilty. He kind of stood by her.
Well, he loved her, probably. He probably loved, I have no doubt. So,
and I suspect couldn't believe it when he heard what was going on. When she was arrested.
I was reading one of the articles the other night, and it said that from the scene when she was getting arrested, the kids called John to come there, and I thought, wow, that's kind of heartbreaking. They're calling him to come. Their only living parent is getting hauled off, and they're calling John. And imagine that night in his mind. I really, honestly, wish I could have talked to John Munden, about this case. But you were the next best thing. So
the sad part is you didn't get to talk to John, because I'll tell you what, he was a walking encyclopedia of this case. There was nothing he couldn't remember. And he kept, I don't know whatever became of him, but he kept copious notes on stuff. He had audio tapes of interviews with people. John was he was obsessed with trying to solve this case. He used to have a saying that he'd heard someplace. It was on his wall. I'm trying to think. To say that a crime is a mystery and cannot be solved is to admit incapability. And that hung in his office forever, as long as he was on the sheriff's department.
After she got out of prison, Nieves sold the Lindner family business and allowed John to open a machine shop with some of the proceeds. That's what John Munden did for the next 20 years. He ran a machine shop that was started from funds that Nieves made from selling her own business. They certainly seemed to have something that looks a lot like love to me. They worked together for years in the same office. He was there for her when she needed him with her children, because they were minors when she went to prison. When she came home, they bought a house and tried to start over, but it just didn't work. I'm told that when John Munden got sick, Nieves was there to help care for him. John Munden died in 2018, at the age of 71. This part of the story left me wondering about Munden and whether he knew about Nieves' role in the sale of drugs. The DEA said they'd been monitoring her and her brother for about 3 years, and Munden was certainly part of her life during that time. The Fed documents mention about 30 drug buys at that Cranberry Estates home while Munden was there. Sources that I spoke with were hesitant to believe that John Munden knew about the drugs, but they also wondered this: what kind of a detective are you if you don't know what's happening right under your nose? I have to agree with that sentiment, but I'm also not left with the sense that John Munden was a bad man. In fact, the opposite. I think he was a good man, or certainly trying to be. I think too often the urge is to put humans in a box. They're good or they're bad. And the fact is, none of us are either. All of us are both. But I also know how close that John Munden got to Steve Snedegar, and how he made mistakes investigating that case. Importantly, sources close to the Lindner family recall conversations with Steve and John where they were discussing Trudy and how John Munden believed that she had killed her own daughter. That source remembers being very concerned about John Munden expressing those thoughts to Steve Snedegar and feeling very uncomfortable about it. If this is true, was it something John Munden said to Steve Snedegar that led him to kill his own wife? I don't think we will ever have the answer to that one, but my concern is that John Munden got it wrong. With a case described to me as one he could never put away, what if he was wrong? What if Trudy Snedegar got killed because John Munden got it wrong? I think when you run out of puzzle pieces that fit, you start trying to make things fit. I feel like that was the case with John. I heard that from a source even before I received documents and information that made me doubt John Munden's theory of Lora Morris's murder. So when I reread it in my notes, it surprised me in the way that confirmation of something that's been niggling at you often does. For what it's worth, Nieves Munden, she didn't believe it either. "You're wrong. She didn't do it," Nieves had told John. Part of me wonders if, like me, as a mom herself, she just can't fathom the idea of killing your own child. Well after he resigned his job, John Munden continued to work with investigators on Lora Morris's case. Indiana State Police and officials in Florida mined the vast knowledge of details that he had collected over the years as they continued to track down leads. With all the time that was invested in this case, I feel like there should have been a very different outcome. But it seems like the bodies just kept piling up. My source said, I don't feel like Trudy or Steve killed their daughter. However, that's not to say they didn't harm other people. I was beginning to consider the exact same thing. Stay tuned.
When you try to love, it's like you die a little. But not in a way that's selfish and vain, but that's sacrificial. That's reciprocal and mystical and visceral. You get what I'm getting at? I wanna love continuously and not so strenuously. How can I love one love when there's so many people love them back? So many ways I could react, so many days I think I should in fact become bohemian like Liszt, or James Brown, or Nikola Tesla, or anyone else that one should aim to be in this day and age.